The skies of Meraxis Prime still bled when Queen Tira stepped alone into the charred valley where her daughter's last signal had vanished. The wind carried the distant clatter of falling wreckage and the ghost echo of battles long ended, but to her it all sounded like a lullaby turned to ash. Her armor, once glistening with honor and conquest, now hung heavy as ruin. The emerald crest of House Valshea cracked at her shoulder. She moved without entourage, without title, without voice, just a mother clawing through the soot and bones of war, searching for a child she already knew she would not find. Treva found the scarf hours later, torn, dirtied, and fused to a twisted rail of metal deep in the crater's basin. Her breath caught as she dropped to her knees, trembling hands lifting the fragile cloth to her face, like it might still carry the scent of her daughter's hair. Around her, the night opened with cold stars, but none of them shone for her anymore. There had been thousands of casualties in the Great Rift War, but only one that shattered the might of an empress. Sorel. She didn't weep. Treva sat for hours with the scarf pressed to her chest, refusing to move, refusing to eat, refusing to let anyone touch her. Not guards, not priests, not even her oldest friend. The woman once feared as the Iron Wind of Valtor, who had commanded fleets that could silence entire systems, now sat in the ruins like a broken statue, with no prayer left to offer. And when her prime minister knelt beside her and whispered, "The people need to see you strong," she finally looked up with bloodshot eyes and said, "Then tell them their queen is dead too." Thousands of kilometers away, across the scorched lattice of exodus routes and fractured trade lines, a human soldier trudged through an abandoned outpost with blood in his boots and a child in his arms. Captain Rain Voss had fought in 13 campaigns, seen comrades dissolve beneath plasma fire, and once survived 2 days in the vacuum of a breached station. But nothing had shaken him more than the sight of a small alien girl curled beneath a collapsed bulkhead, her face streaked with soot, clinging to a glowing shard of crystal like it was her soul. She didn't scream when he found her. She only opened her violet eyes, stared at his face, and whispered one word he didn't understand. Amari. He tried to find her people. Over the next 10 days, Rain carried her through minefields and ice trenches, surviving ambushes, wild storms, and even a hungry Varrock beast that tore into his leg before he blasted it with a sidearm while shielding the girl with his own body. She didn't cry once. She only held the shard tighter and began to hum lullabies to him, as though she were comforting him instead. Rain didn't know who she was. He didn't know that the emblem etched faintly on the shard was the lost royal sigil of Valshea, or that she was thought dead by an empire now teetering on grief. He only knew that someone had left her behind, and that leaving her behind again was something he would never do. So he wrapped her in the remnants of his cloak, tightened his grip, and walked toward a future he hadn't imagined, and a woman whose world he'd already changed without knowing her name. The palace had gone silent long ago. No festivals, no chants, no parades. The empire of Valshea no longer celebrated, it endured. Queen Treva remained locked in her chamber, rising only to visit the shattered monument where she'd placed her daughter's memory, now protected by crystal wards and guarded by the most loyal warriors left. Rumors spread like black moss through the marble halls, that she hadn't spoken in months, that her heart was being consumed by blood rot, that the Queen of Steel had melted into a woman of grief. But deep beneath the capital spire, unknown to all, she had begun to paint. Not grand murals or political symbols, but small scenes, memory fragments of a time when her daughter ran barefoot through the royal gardens, chasing fireflies while her mother watched from a distance, armored and untouchable. Each stroke of color was a rebellion against despair, a whispered defiance of the universe's cruelty. She painted to remember, and yet every completed piece seemed only to confirm Sorel's absence, like carving songs into tombstones. When her attendants begged her to resume council meetings, Treva said nothing. Not until a courier ship arrived from a Terran fleet, bearing only a name and a voice print file. The Queen, who had ignored hundreds of transmissions, sat bolt upright as the message played, unpolished, crackling, and unmistakably human. A man's voice said, "I found a little girl, says her name is Sorel. She's safe, but she won't let go of this old crystal and keeps asking for someone named Amari." Captain Rain Voss had never been inside an interspecies sanctuary before, and everything about it made him uneasy. The filtered gravity, the sterile air laced with mood dampeners, the way guards stared like he was carrying a time bomb instead of a child. Cyril sat on his lap now, braiding a strand of his dirty brown hair into knots as he filled out papers he didn't understand. Every form asked him to surrender custody, report status, declare species, designate ownership. But Cyril's tiny arms wrapped tighter around his neck each time he reached for a pen. "She won't sleep unless you're near," the nurse whispered, amazed. He hadn't planned on staying with her this long. He had missions to return to, comrades still waiting, a war tribunal hearing that might court-martial him for going off-grid. But every time he looked at her, the way she smiled when he peeled fruit for her, the way she pressed her forehead to his when she was scared, he knew leaving her would break something inside him that no battlefield ever had. 3 days passed. On the 4th, the skies above the sanctuary trembled as a royal dreadnought descended, silent, dark, and crowned with the unmistakable symbol of Valshea. Rain stood at the gates with Cyril in his arms, watching as a procession of guards stepped down and parted to reveal a figure in white and obsidian armor. Her steps were slow, as if her soul dragged behind her, and when her eyes found Cyril's, the entire galaxy stopped breathing. Queen Tereva had not run in centuries, not during coronation riots, not when enemy blades shattered her front lines, not even when her daughter's body was declared unrecoverable. But when she saw the girl with violet eyes peeking nervously from behind the chestplate of a human soldier, the grief shackled to her heart snapped like brittle iron. Her stride dissolved into desperate motion, her armor clattering as she dropped to her knees before the child she had buried in her mind 100 times. Cyril stared for only a second before whispering, "Amari," and leapt into her mother's arms. The queen sobbed with no care for rank or posture. There was no elegance in it, no royal dignity, only the unfiltered, shuddering release of a soul reknitting itself through the impossible. She cradled the girl's face with trembling hands, brushing away layers of soot and dust and disbelief, and whispered over and over, How are you here?" But Cyril only smiled and pointed at Rain, as if he were the answer to everything. Guards tightened their grip on weapons, unsure what protocol required. Here stood the Queen's daughter, thought dead, in the arms of a man from a world once barely tolerated by the Galactic Court. Rain raised his hands slowly, unsure if he should salute or speak or simply breathe. "I didn't know who she was," he said gently, "but I knew she needed someone." Dreva rose slowly, the child still clinging to her. She stepped forward, every inch of her trembling, not with weakness, but with something she hadn't felt since before the war, awe. "You carried her?" she asked. Rain nodded, and that was when her voice cracked, not from command but reverence. "Then you carried the future of my people in your arms, and I owe you a galaxy I no longer rule." The days that followed reshaped everything. Royal broadcasts announced Cyril's return as not just a miracle but a new epoch. Political factions that had threatened civil war went silent, leaders wept on live feeds, and countless alien races sent emissaries bearing gifts they once used to bribe warlords. But at the heart of it all stood Rain, a Terran soldier with no title, no medals, no desire for glory, quietly watching it all unfold as the girl he saved was crowned heir to a world reborn. Yet it wasn't the crown that shook him. It was the way Tereva looked at him, not as a ruler eyeing a foreigner, but as a woman who had lost everything and somehow found it all again. At night, when they walked the palace corridors together, she would ask about Earth, about Terran gardens and storms and songs. And when he told her of the times Cyril hummed lullabies to keep him awake while snipers circled them in the ruins, Tereva had to look away so he wouldn't see her tears. One evening, she found him alone in the royal archives. He stood near a digital fresco that showed her younger self holding an infant Cyril, back when her armor still gleamed and her eyes burned with defiance instead of longing. "Why didn't you run when you found her?" she asked softly. Rain shrugged. "Because she didn't. She waited for someone, so I stayed." She stepped closer, the shadows wrapping them like velvet. "You're not just a soldier, Rain Voss," she said, placing a hand on his. "You're the thread that pulled my heart back from death." And as her fingers tightened slightly, neither of them moved away. In a palace still haunted by echoes of war, a quiet promise bloomed, something fragile, human, and infinite. By the time the coronation festival approached, the outer worlds had already begun calling it the Age of Return. The ancient scar banners of Valshea were lowered, replaced by the gold and violet crest of Seral's lineage reborn. Delegates from the Zarthin Concord, once bitter enemies, arrived bearing relics and peace treaties, their leaders bowing not to military strength, but to the miracle of survival embodied by a child once presumed lost. But in the midst of these political tides, Rain found himself more a guest than a hero. Wandering marbled halls with a little girl tugging at his hand and a queen who refused to leave his side for long. The palace had changed. What was once steel and shadows now pulsed with color, warmth, and strange laughter echoing through halls that had only ever known command. Sorel ran barefoot through royal gardens that had been silent for years, her laughter awakening long-dormant security drones who now flickered with ceremonial ribbons just to amuse her. And every time she laughed, Rain looked to Teriva, who stood beneath the terrace trees, watching them both as if afraid the moment would vanish again. But the queen no longer wore fear like a second skin. She smiled, more each day, allowing herself moments where duty softened into longing and strength melted into silence beside Rain. She would walk the memory hall with him and listen to him describe Earth's blue mountains and the way wind whistled through empty battlefields. And one evening, as they stood above the balcony where the coronation platform was being built, she looked at him. Not like a savior, not like a soldier, but like a man she hadn't dared dream of before war had hollowed her. "I wish you were one of us," she said gently, voice low. He shook his head and smiled. "No," he said. "You just wish I didn't have to leave." Departure orders came sooner than either wanted. The Terran High Command had learned of Rain's actions through diplomatic echoes, and what began as a minor field report had ignited a political storm. He was summoned to return, debrief, and likely be reassigned before diplomatic representatives arrived to formalize Earth's first direct treaty with Valshea. But Rain did not rush to pack. He walked the gardens one last time, pressed his palm to the marble that bore Seral's new crest, and sat beneath the crystal willow tree where she first asked if she could call him home. Seral begged him to stay. Treva stood behind her, saying nothing, watching the man who had become part of her soul prepare to vanish into the bureaucracy of a different galaxy. "I was nothing but a name," she whispered, stepping forward at last, "a war title carved in blood. And you made me a mother again." He turned slowly, his duffel still in hand. She took it from him gently and set it aside. "What would Earth do," she asked, with a flicker of defiance in her voice, "if I declared you an honorary royal guardian of my heir?" Rain stared, stunned. "They'd demand paperwork." Riva laughed for the first time in years. Not the soft, regal smile of royalty, but the raw, shaking laughter of a woman who had grieved so long she forgot joy could be so bold. She took his hand and placed it over her own heart. "Then let them demand," she said. "Because if you leave now, I may conquer Earth just to get you back." The following morning, the palace was swarmed not by warlords, but by Terran envoys, dressed in diplomatic blacks with glowing insignias and sharp, measured speech. They came expecting political maneuvering, layers of royal arrogance, and complex ceremonial tributes. Yet they were met by a queen who stood at the gates herself, hand in hand with a human soldier and her daughter perched proudly on his shoulder. General Varn, the lead diplomat, glanced between the scene and his tablet before whispering to his assistant, "This isn't how negotiations begin. This looks like a farewell parade or a wedding." Rain saluted instinctively as the Terran delegation approached, but Treva simply said, "You bow to your superiors. I kneel only to those I love." The delegation didn't know what to say. Rain stepped forward, offering to translate the quiet storm in the Queen's gaze with words their protocol books would never print. "If you came to retrieve a soldier," he said, "you're too late. She's claimed me as family, adopted, official, and fully bound by ancient rites of Valshean fire." The diplomat stiffened until Serel, still sitting on his shoulder, yawned loudly and whispered, "Can they make him pancakes too?" Reva smirked at the stunned silence and turned. She waved her arm and the palace gates opened not to a war court, but to a ceremonial amphitheater covered in bloom lights and woven banners. Thousands had gathered. War veterans, orphans, healers, and council survivors, each one there not for policy but to witness what they had once thought impossible. Today, she declared, we celebrate not power but survival, not dominance but restoration. And when Rain was summoned to stand beside her, he almost declined. But Sorel pushed his back gently, whispering, "Don't be scared, you're already our hero." He stepped up beside the queen, dressed in nothing more than his worn uniform and the scars of too many front lines, and when she offered her hand, the crowd gasped, not because a queen dared reach for a Terran, but because she did so with a softness that silenced every doubt that ever dared speak of war. The ceremony continued until stars burned over the palace, and the music became a lullaby for a galaxy that had not slept in peace for a generation. Reva had not intended to bind herself to anyone ever again. She had buried love alongside duty, stacked it beneath her children's coffins and the bones of shattered allies. But when she turned toward Rain that night, watching him speak gently to her daughter, she realized no empire could offer what he had given freely. Presence. She knelt before no tribunal, no bloodline, no prophecy, but she bowed her head before the man who gave her back her child, her laughter, and her right to feel without fear. In the garden that once served as a war-planning terrace, they sat together under silence, watching Sorel chase lights along the water. Rain leaned back, his voice low. Still strange, being needed more for kindness than strategy. Reva touched his wrist. And I ruled with fear for so long, I forgot what mercy felt like, until I saw you carrying my daughter through fire. Then she turned toward him slowly, eyes dark as moonless sea, and asked not as a queen, but as a woman still bleeding from old wars, "Will you stay?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a tiny, soot-stained toy he had kept hidden from Sorel, the one she dropped on the first night he carried her. He handed it to her wordlessly, and the girl beamed like it was treasure. Then he met Reva's gaze and said, "I already did." They kissed beneath the old tree of ancestors, once planted as a tribute to fallen kings. The people watching didn't cheer. They just stood in reverent silence, as if the galaxy itself had exhaled. And for the first time in countless cycles, Valshea no longer feared tomorrow. Because someone had carried hope on his shoulders and refused to let it die.